Good
Hello.
morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you may be. This is Mickey Connolly, and I'm here with my colleagues, with Emma Rose and Carolyn French and Anne Marie Allen. And today we're hosting a conversation regarding empathy. And for us, empathy is experiencing the experience of another human being without adding opinion or judgment to it. And we're going to delve into how does it matter now as a part of our connection diaries, which is these ongoing conversations we're doing in the midst of the COVID crisis. So, Emma Rose, do you want to give us a little information about how to best take advantage of being together?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everybody. I'm Emma Rose, and I'm going to be here sort of as a silent background person, trying to make sure everybody's inclusion in the chat is going to be brought into the conversation. I do want to just remind everybody to change your chat setting to be to all panelists, to all participants and not just the panelists, so that we can all see what you're thinking and want to put out there. And then I will be monitoring, so anything that I think will be important for us to touch on, I will bring to the attention of our lovely panelists, and we'll be sure to answer any questions that way.
All right, thanks. Well, we will delve into this right away. And as we said, we consider empathy to be the capacity to experience the experience of another without judgment or opinion. And my first question, Anne, I'll go to you first, is what has that be meaningful now? So I know you really wanted to be in this conversation, so it must matter as far as you're concerned. And why, pray tell, does it?
Well, welcome everybody. I am excited to be here talking about empathy. It wasn't that long ago that I saw an article, I think it was in Time magazine, saying the end of empathy. And it was basically an article that talked about how our culture and our society right now has decided not to be empathetic with people that don't share their views or see them as part of their shared community. Some people call it tribe. And that's where they're going to have empathy, but nowhere else. And I found that disheartening, and also the wrong thing to amplify, because right now, given that we are experiencing so much polarization politically across the board in terms of different communities and belief systems, we need empathy, which is natural to us anyway as human beings. We need to tap into that. That's how we connect. That's how we cross boundaries. And that's how we solve problems that can't be solved any other way. So now is the time to turn back to what is our human nature. The fact that we biologically are connected neurologically through our mirror neurons and through our consciousness. We need to call on that right now.
Beautiful. Thanks for making the case. And Carolyn, from your perspective, what has this been so important?
Yeah, my reason is really similar to Anne's, and it's actually funny. I just thought of this just now. I was getting the mail the other day with my gloves on, and reading the front cover of a report from the Southern Poverty Law Center that said, "The Year in Fear and Terror." That was the cover of it. And I thought, oh my gosh, how awful and how true in some ways. And it also reminds me that, especially in times of crisis, our relationships with each other and to each other are really what keep us surviving. And our relationships together actually allow us to thrive when we're empathetic with each other. And in this time of crisis, there's not a better time to understand what empathy is, to draw on our natural instincts. I believe that we all have that natural instinct and that we can actually build it as well. So that's why it's important to me right now.
Yeah. And, our biology is based on it, Carolyn, and our social nature. But at the same time, we can kind of, if we don't practice it, if we don't make the time to be with some person or a group of people, be fully present and curious about who they are, we could lose that You know, it could be harder and harder to find the empathy or the time for empathy or whatever when it's most important to those working with other people or trying to understand our communities better.
I want to add a perspective for me that has always mattered, which is what's the practical power of this? And I think in all the organizations that we've been privileged to serve, their biggest commitments can't be achieved without cooperation, without people coming together and having something that they're willing to collaborate about, to be better together about. And the degree to which we have empathy for one another, the trust goes up and conflict goes down. So the conflict that actually interferes with our cooperation gets turned into learning and often creativity and better solutions. So I think the lack of empathy causes a dearth of creativity because it has differences separate us rather than make us smarter. So that's the reason that occurs to me as each of you were talking about why this is so important. Another question I've got is, for any of you who are listening, what concerns or interests you about empathy? There may be things we can address right now, but also as we get the results of all the chat input, it'll give us things to delve into that we can get back to you that we think might be useful. One of the things I often hear from people who buy the case, yeah, this sounds important. The question is, well, how do I be good at it? So I go back, Carolyn and Ann, to you. And Carolyn, I'll start with you this time. How do we be good at this? Ann just said it's important to practice. Well, what are some ways we can practice?
Right. There's a chapter in the Vitality Imperative about empathy, and there are things that we call the empathy killers. And those things are things that I can personally, I'm just talking from my own experience, that I can practice getting good at catching when they happen. Things like hurry, stress, wanting to make sure I look like I know what I'm doing, or I have an answer, or that I'm right, or that the other person is wrong. Any of those things, any of those empathy killers will take me out of actually truly trying to connect with the other person and what's important to them and what their experience is. I'll just share a very quick little personal story. Someone in the chat mentioned that empathy is a great topic right now because of cabin fever. People are all sort of stuck together in these little pods, and that it might be coming up might be more difficult to practice at this point. I had a situation yesterday with my husband who went out to do something, and there was someone in our yard, and he did not have my husband didn't have his mask on. And so I came out with my gloved hand with a mask for him and tried to give it to him because I thought that that was the thing that needed to happen right then. Let me just say that that did not go so well. He was not very happy about that. And it caused this flare up of emotion, which we actually then kind of had to get over. But then we talked through what was going on for him at that moment, what was going on for me. I'm trying to take care of him. He felt embarrassed, blah, blah, blah. And we actually got back to being connected to each other and what was going on in each of our experience, which was empathy. And so it's just an example of how those things can come up and how I was not catching myself in that moment.
Yeah. That's a great example of, when you don't have it, and then how you may have to work to regain it. I go to examples of, maybe I don't know somebody at all, but I create, or I bring my curiosity and I accept being present versus, oh, I'm thinking about something else right now, versus the person I'm sitting next to, or I maybe have an exercise, a breakout exercise in a meeting with. And if I'm fully present and curious, I find that empathy for me is easy because I'm just drawn in to that other person and what they're telling me. And my experience is whatever judgment I had about the way somebody looks, how old or young they were, or you know, how fashionable or not or unfashionable they were has nothing to do with what I discover. And I'm usually just totally taken and enthralled. And, you know, this is always delightful. It's like, well, I couldn't have guessed that about that person. Wow. And if I'm really intending to work with this person, if I'm part of a group where we want to establish unprecedented collaboration, this is just a requirement. You know, we're not smarter collectively if we don't have that shared empathy, where we kind of become our own entity in a sense. We're that connected to each other. We have to enter each other's experience and then leverage that to a greater wisdom. So that's why it's important.
That's really good, and it stimulates a couple things that I think are consistent with a couple things that I saw come in through the chat. This is all inside of the, well, how do we be good at this? You know, how does this work operationally in the real world? One of the questions that came up is, how do you create empathy in others? And it goes back, I think, to the neuroscience that Ann was referring to. In the discussion about mirror neurons, Daniel Goleman said people catch your mood faster than they catch a cold, or in this case, faster than they catch the virus. And what we found, and why it takes a discipline, is that if you are empathetic for another and they experience that, they then tend to be empathetic themselves. But it's a question of who's willing to go first. You know, wait a minute, I don't feel deeply understood and respected by you, so why should I? As Jim Matroni, our partner, often says, sometimes you have to decide who's going to be the adult in the conversation. And I think that that capacity to have somebody else experience that you understand and respect their purposes, their concerns, their circumstances, that they see you learning about them, not just saying back to them what they said, but that you really are gaining insight about what life is like for them in that particular area, that they will then tend to be interested in the other in the same way. So if you want to take advantage of our neuroscientific constitution, the way you take advantage of mirror neurons is you create an experience for somebody else to be in that then they naturally extend to you. So that's one thing to practice, is catch the moments when you feel like they shouldn't be like they are, when they're wrong and you're right, and you're having all of the experiences that interfere with empathy. Can you take a breath and say, before anything else, I'm going to understand them from their perspective, that I'm actually going to have connection prior to convincing them to be another way. Another question that came up I thought was really good is, can you be both authentic and empathetic? And those of you who are familiar with our distinctions in the conversation meter, you know, there's three kinds of truth in it. There's sincerity, accuracy, and authenticity. For us, it's difficult to be only sincere and empathetic, because sincerity just requires I'm saying what I really feel and think without any necessary regard for what you feel and think. Authenticity is actually being true to ourselves in the midst of curiosity about what it means for another to be true to themselves, and then look for the intersection. So authenticity includes interest in what is true for the other. Because for us, authenticity is being true to ourselves, but not at the exclusion of another human being. It's
Nikki,
discovering.
The one thing that I just add to that is that it is being true to ourselves, and the word that really rings true for me is I don't have to agree with that other person or the experience that they're having or the feelings that they're having, but as another human being, I am honoring them. I can do it in an honorable way and listen to them and understand their experience. I don't have to agree with it, but I can get curious about what has them think that, what has them feel that.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I would agree. I would just, this isn't, being empathetic is really not about, well, I always get really jazzed about it because it's like taking a little trip. I mean, God, I get to get absorbed into this other person's experience. And so it's not about my experience. I get to release myself from that for a while to really discover and be delighted by, or maybe moved by somebody else's. But when I step back and process that, it's an expansive feeling, what I found, not just for me, but for the people that I was engaged in trying to truly connect with. We all feel bigger from that. And that's why it's so powerful collectively to take the time to get to know each other that way.
A
One
couple
thing
other
I'd like
things.
to, can I
Go
just
ahead.
bring one thing up really quickly from the chat? I think something that's really relevant right now that would also answer some of the questions here. What is the relationship of stress to authenticity, and how can we combat how that might retract our ability to be empathetic?
So is that the relationship between stress and empathy, or stress and authenticity, or
Stress
both?
and so how does stress affect our ability to be empathetic, and then how can we be agents of increasing our empathy during times of stress?
This is a awfully timely question, because people are living in the presence of a lot of stress. And under stress, people tend to retract. Their attention tends to go more towards their own experience. So actually, you could use the experience of stress as a moment to take a breath and become curious about the other, like notice stress. So for us, one of the most important things to do with stress is acknowledge it, notice it. Is it physical stress? Is it showing up in your body? Is it emotional stress? Is it intellectual stress? But if you can catch it, you can correct and start being interested in the other. One of the ways that I recommend that I think is a way to also practice, look at a time you were under stress when someone else really delved into what was going on for you, what was legitimate about it, what were you seeing, feeling, thinking, and what did that do for you?
Mm-hmm.
So go navigate some historical stress moments where someone else was truly empathetic about you. And then start catching stress
Yeah.
and
And
shift to
I,
being that for the other.
and I would add, that's probably the biggest benefit of someone listening to another in a very empathic way. It's a stress reducer. And I feel for the healthcare workers right now, because if they're surrounded in most of their day taking care of people that, maybe aren't fully conscious, or, they've got families that are urgently worried and maybe not thinking so much about the healthcare worker as the patient. I those and I have some relatives that are in the healthcare world who are nurses and practitioners of different sorts. They need others to hear their story, to understand their experience, because they're on the front lines of something very important right now. And if we are connected with anyone like that, are we checking in with them? Are we taking the time to really be present to what their life's like right now, and hopefully being of service in terms of helping reduce stress in the process?
And you remind me of, as some of you definitely know from our work with military and police in very high stress situations, that one of the things that someone taught us 30 years ago that remains really important to me is that anyone who occurs to you as a villain is a hero in their own story. So what's the story in which they're the protagonist? What's the story in which they're legitimate? And to discover the story somebody's living in about the experience, that's another really practical thing to do, Ann. So thanks for bringing that up, that we all live in a narrative about who we are in the circumstance that we occupy at the moment. And if I care for that more than I care for making you like me, empathy has a chance. So the issue of vulnerability just came up in the chat too. So how do you practice being vulnerable enough to have the experience of another be more important than grinding my axe in this moment? So how do the two of you respond to that? How does vulnerability play into empathy?
Well, I'll just share that one of the things I learned over the years at Conversant, and from one very smart person in particular, was that when I am feeling scared or vulnerable, one of the ways I can get myself out of my own fear about, am I enough? Do I have an answer? Am I enough of an expert in this situation? Whatever the thought is that comes to mind, which has taken me away from the other person that I'm with. One way I can do that is to just ask questions. That I actually stop trying to give an answer or provide advice, but that I actually only ask questions. And what that does for me is it lessens my own vulnerability, and it increases, I've noticed it increases the other person's, because in the really genuine, curious question that I'm asking, the other person begins to feel more heard, more understood, more connected, and they open themselves more to whatever is present for both of us.
I love the practicality of that. When I'm feeling vulnerable, ask a question. that could shift me right there.
Right. And the one question that I know not to ask is why? And the why doesn't work because it goes to a cognitive place of trying to explain something. What I'm more interested in is, what are the circumstances that have you be in the place that you're in? And so saying, what has you say that? Or for you, what's important about that? Those are questions that are really helpful to me. And it gets me out of myself, just like Anne was saying.
Yeah. I know when Peter Senge wrote the book, The Fifth Discipline, and interviewed a lot of leaders across multiple organizations, a point was made by several of them that as a leader, your greatest asset is your vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I think of people that can be comfortable with that and harness that, they really are probably empathetic leaders. They're leaders that people know they can count on to understand their experience. They don't just, make orders from the top or direct people from the top. They take the time to connect with what is the experience of people on the front lines of this business or this nonprofit. What are they truly experiencing? I would be arrogant for me to think I know. And if I can really take the time to step into that, again, with curiosity and presence, I can be so much better informed. But that's me saying, I don't have the answer. I want to learn from all of you and your experiences. I think that's very powerful. If you're looking at how does this show up for leaders in organizations.
Putting that in the context of people who have position power in organizations, who have leadership positions, it brings up another of the things that Carolyn was referring to earlier, because we say position power itself endangers empathy. And vulnerability for somebody with a lot of position power can show up like the fear of not getting my agenda. That if I engage with you, it's going to slow or diminish the chances of having what I think should happen. And so an interesting question I think I've seen some leaders in very powerful positions do to keep themselves from being too self-absorbed and letting their position power eliminate being interested in other people is to stop and ask the question, if I carefully listen to this person or these people, what could I possibly lose? And how could I be hurt? And what people tell me over and over, when they do that, they realize not much. And usually what they come up with is a few minutes. Okay, is that few minutes investment worth the trust building that comes from another human being know they've been included, respected, and understood?
A personal story of mine was once I was traveling. I was gone for 3 weeks. I had a global staff. I came back. We had a staff meeting, and they were all angry. Just felt I don't know whether it was abandoned or just not sure of what they were facing, and that was directed at me. And I remember saying to myself as I sat with that in the room, people getting upset, I said, "Shut up, Ann, you might learn something." and I did. I was just like, I am gonna be curious. This is a time to practice that. It really is. And it was amazing. And I should say, not just for me, but everyone in that room shifted. And suddenly that anger and frustration transformed itself into a lot of collective power. They solved a lot of problems themselves and we all felt so much better by the end of the meeting. And I said almost nothing. So it's that being willing to be vulnerable, to sit in it, be curious, and trust that, if you truly have empathy, some extraordinary possibilities emerge.
That's grand. I know we're getting close to the end of our time. Emma Rose, is there anything you want to say to people so they know what they can expect following this?
So we'll be sending out the recording link through our newsletter, which will come out next week. We've been releasing it weekly to announce these little webinars as well as short little videos on these topics and some other resources that we think would be valuable at this time. So I will go ahead and put the link to sign up for the newsletter in the chat here in case you aren't already subscribed. And we'll make sure that you get all of the current info and everything we think that might be able to add value to your experience right now.
That's great. And Carolyn and Ann, anything that you'd like to say in closing in this little 30-minute slice of life devoted to empathy?
Just like to say that in these little slices of life, as you say, we have an opportunity in each conversation that we're in to practice. You can do it privately. It's like a secret little experiment that you can take on. And just in this one, I was managing my own vulnerability. I don't know what I'm doing. So I just thought that I would ask some questions and it went okay. So it's just a good place. I encourage people to just take it on as a game and see what you learn.
I would just, a closing thought would be, even though it's our essential human nature to empathize with others, it does require intentionality, especially in this era. So I would put it this way: empathy, use it or lose it.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks all of you who took the time to be with us today. We will continue these connection diaries, and they're being informed by the questions and concerns that many of you are expressing with us. Thank you for sticking with us through the crisis. We are confident that we are stronger, safer, smarter together. So we love being together with you. Thanks, everybody. We'll be in touch in different ways.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.